I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hi folks, and welcome to my newest episode. Before diving right into this episode, I wanted to thank everyone for listening to Hellbent for Horror. Like many of you, these last 3 years and counting have significantly been challenging for many reasons. But believe it or not, Hellbent for Horror is still standing. Now, I'm grateful for all the kind words and emails that I've gotten, and I want to say that they genuinely do make a difference. It's very simple. Those of you who listen, give the show its power. Now, if you like the show and you feel it's entertained you during these dark times, please help spread that sickness to others. Your reviews, social media shares, and word of mouth praise are really essential to me. Honestly, your kind words and your reviews on iTunes have taken the show to more places than any advertising guy could have ever delivered. I thank all of you for listening, and I thank all of you who continue to help us through your kind support. My primary purpose for creating Hellbent for Horror was to start a conversation, and I thank all of you for promoting my bad behavior. And now, on with the show. This is part 1 of a 2-part series. Friedrich Nietzsche's most famous quote, and arguably the most famous quote in all of philosophy, goes like this: "Beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you." Here we are, 3 years since the start of a pandemic that not too long ago we thought was dying down. Instead, we celebrated too soon. And another strain spread like wildfire across the globe, and then another strain and another. Since then, we've had multiple variants, and the pandemic moves like a teenager learning to drive a stick shift. I think it's safe to say that we have become a little more acquainted with the abyss over the last 3 years. When nature sent us to our collective rooms, I don't think any of us really could get our heads around just how long this might go on. Did you know that the social distancing caused by the pandemic has gone on so long that linguists are testing to see if new accents are developing? That's right. One of the critical elements to the development of regional accents is isolation from diverse stimuli. Isolation can change everything. And here is where we have a heavy dose of irony. Because of the isolation, 2020 might have been the most introspective year our civilization has had since the start of the Industrial Revolution. When offices and warehouses closed during the lockdown and we worked from home, it seemed we had a rare opportunity. We had that time we always dreamed about, some extra time to devote to our families and to ourselves. We got a chance to slow things down, take stock of our lives, and meditate, perhaps even self-reflect. What did we do with this time for meditation and self-reflection? We lost our fucking minds. 2020 was a year of seemingly endless rage, where there were multiple mass shootings and more than one riot in more than one metro area. And then came the year 2021. If 2020 was like a car wreck, 2021 was like getting rear-ended repeatedly as the car accident became a traffic pileup. Not 6 days into 2021, an armed insurgency at the United States Capitol left 5 people dead. Nietzsche's abyss stared right back at us and grinned. Some of us saw monsters, some of us became monsters. And then came 2022, which was like we were all at the car accident scene waiting for the police and the ambulance to arrive. We spent all of 2022 on the curb, in shock and bleeding, waiting for someone to show up and end this nightmare. And now here we are in 2023, and the help we waited for finally shows. And you know what? We don't have health insurance. The thing about the abyss the thing that nobody could plan for, is that you can't see the end of it, no matter how hard you stare. And that inability to come to a resolution can drive you crazy. Scientists, doctors, pharmaceutical companies work relentlessly around the clock, creating remedies to protect our bodies. But nothing was being done for our minds. In all fairness, what could they do? We navigated the fear of the unknown around the disease, and then we managed the anxiety of quarantine, and then we reconciled with the dread that we were in an entropy spiral. We assumed that the infrastructure was barely holding together, and we rolled with those punches. And then life got surreal and absurd. Who would have thought that the apocalypse would have takeout? Yet the guy who delivered my Kung Pao chicken was considered an essential employee and worked all the way through the pandemic. Pizza delivery people complete a civic duty you usually need to take an oath before performing. What was passing as reality felt pretty insane. And just like it had in every decade before, horror movies helped us by giving us monsters and boogeymen to stand in for the real ones. And when Hollywood had to shut down the dream machine during our plague, independent horror movies came in to save the day, and the audience and the culture took notice. Even the New York Times began reporting on what I've said for years: horror helps us safely deal with the real dangers of our world. Now, many folks assumed that I watched a lot of zombie apocalypse movies during the pandemic. I'll bet you loved watching zombie movies, didn't you, they'd say. Now, this is interesting to think about because the biggest mainstream television hit series before the pandemic was about zombies. I think that deep in our subconscious, we suspected something like the pandemic was coming, and the culture suddenly made zombies a hit. So, what was my answer when asked if I watched a lot of zombie films over the pandemic? Fuck no! I didn't want to watch zombie movies. I was already burned out on them by the time the pandemic came. Plus, they were too on the nose. I could give a shit about the disease. I was much more interested in watching films about how the disease changed us, changed our culture, and changed our beliefs. When horror goes deep, it gives an external face to our internal fears, our inner monsters. When I looked at the movies and limited horror series in the last 3 years, I saw a few provocative trends and themes that were emerging from them. What scared us at the movies was a subconscious mirror that accurately reflected what frightened us in the real world. Now, that statement of mine brings me to a caveat that I think should be said aloud. Although some of the discussed films were made during the pandemic with skeleton crews and two-people casts, most of them were not. I'm very aware that many of these films, especially documentaries, were planned or started before COVID-19 even existed. So I'm not saying that every writer and director here intentionally went out to comment on specific newsworthy things that happened. But that doesn't mean that they didn't end up collectively commenting on trends that ended up being specific newsworthy things that happened. Horror writers and directors make their living figuring out what scares us at any given moment in history. It is their bread and butter to pay attention and be aware of the culture's overriding anxieties and comment on them. Horror writing does not happen in a vacuum. Seriously, it's not like I'm describing some unique psychic ability. If we are honest, we knew that the horrors we were living through were coming for some time now. Scientists were worried about potential superviruses and pandemics long before COVID-19 hit, and there were always disbelievers of that science. We were worried about the shortage of doctors and first responders and the stress levels of the ones in service since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. We have been worried about increasing violence at protests and demonstrations, including vehicular homicides with drivers running into crowds of demonstrators and full-scale riots in cities. We have been aware of the increase of dangerous misinformation escaping the fringe media and entering the mainstream for a while now. We were little kids in the woods, whistling in the dark, hoping the noise would keep any predators out there away from us. COVID-19 was just the first wolf that came in and bit us. Now, I'm going to break this into lists of movies that echoed certain themes that I saw floating in the culture, and there's been enough of them that I'm going to break this into 2 parts. If you're a longtime listener to the show, or you've read my book, Screaming for Pleasure, you're aware of my idea of the stinger. That's where a movie does visual callbacks to a visual moment or a visceral moment from real life to make you recall the emotions you felt in that real incident. Like how the movie Cloverfield had a giant monster destroying Lower Manhattan, but the image of people running in the streets while plumes of falling building debris smoke filled the air was a stinger to 9/11. Some of the movies I'm going to discuss will have stingers that, if you've watched the film, if you've seen the film, you might have noticed them, or you might notice them if you rewatch them after listening to this. So, how did the abyss we've been staring into since early 2020 change us? Government reports showed that during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, that drug use increased by 30% and 50% increased alcohol consumption and binge drinking. At the same time, the National Institute of Health did a study on how the pandemic was affecting first responders, EMT, police, firefighters. First responders and frontline providers like nurses and doctors had a 3-time higher infection rate. These groups were overworked, and they reported increased feelings of sadness and anxiety with a reluctance to ask for help. There were several films that dealt with the horrors of first responder burnout and the ways they, and the rest of us, try to escape our pain. Here are some movies that follow a trend I call healthcare horror. Probably the movie that hit this theme right on the nose the most is Benson and Moorhead's SYNCHRONIC from 2020. We see a couple lying in a hotel bed after lovemaking, and they decide to end the night by sharing a designer drug. The man leaves the room to get something before the drug takes effect, and he gets in the elevator. When the elevator door opens for him, there is no hotel. It is a desert, and sand starts falling on him as the elevator begins to dissolve. Back in the room, as the drugs affect the woman in the bed, she sees trees and vegetation growing out of the hotel wall. Her look of surprise turns into terror as we see a strange indigenous man in a warrior mask stuck in the very fabric of the wall, halfway in the room. This warrior breathes heavily, terrified, as if the room has appeared out of nowhere around him instead of the other way around. Welcome to the movie version of a Pink Floyd album cover known as SYNCHRONIC. The movie follows 2 New Orleans paramedics who are perpetually exhausted by the increase of drug-related emergencies that are happening in their city. Steve and Dennis, our 2 paramedics, encounter ever stranger incidents as they respond to crime scenes. The first scene is a domestic abuse call. There's an unconscious man on the floor with a stab wound to the chest, a confused, drugged woman, and a teenager who stares ahead in either a drug stupor or in shock. When asked what happened, the drug woman tells them, "I don't know, I heard French, and then the wind." When they inspect the man's stab wound, they find an exit wound in his back, which means this wasn't a standard knife stabbing. And that's when they find a rusted old scabbard sticking out of the wall, a sword so old that the rust has eaten holes in the very metal. The second weird call finds them responding to an abandoned amusement park that was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina a decade earlier. They find a body burned beyond recognition in the main entranceway, but there is no sign of any other fire damage and no sign of accelerants. The third weird call has them responding to a venomous snake bite in a hotel. The weird thing about this is that they can't find the snake, and they are on the hotel's second floor, and the victim is the woman from the first scene. When the anti-venom isn't working, they realize the venom and the fang wound spacing suggests a snake not found in Louisiana, at least not at this time. The one thing that all of these weird calls have in common is that the same designer drug is found at each scene. Its street name is SYNCHRONIC. Things go from weird to terrifying quickly as they roll up upon another SYNCHRONIC party, a drug party that has gone bad. There's a dead teenage boy on the floor, and the girl that was with him in the room has gone missing. When they question another partygoer about where she went, they say that the girl isn't missing. She's gone. She disappeared in front of their eyes, and she was screaming as she disappeared. As they continue questioning the partygoers, we discover that the vanished girl, the girl who was screaming as she disappeared, is the daughter of Dennis, one of the paramedics. Dennis's life crumbles as he searches for his daughter, and Steve, his partner, buys some SYNCHRONIC because he's curious to understand the incredible draw it has, and also to get rid of some of the nightmares that he has. And this starts a journey into a world where reality is fluid, time is a lie, and the secrets of the universe might be in a drug called SYNCHRONIC. Now, New Orleans was an interesting choice for this storyline because the city still struggles with depression and drug use since Hurricane Katrina. Now, just when the Big Easy had finally started to get back to normal life after that disaster, COVID-19 struck. SYNCHRONIC doesn't take place during COVID-19. Quarantines aren't even mentioned. Masks aren't worn in the film. But it was impossible to watch this in the year 2020 and not see the emotional specter of quarantine in every frame of SYNCHRONIC. Another entry in the healthcare horror category is Saint Maud from 2021. Again, it's not that this film takes place during COVID-19, and yet it feels so in tune with our time in the abyss. In Saint Maud, we see a nurse named Katie administering CPR on a dying patient, which, as we see it, is a horrible, bloody, and violent action. She fails to save the man, and his death sends her into a nervous breakdown. The next time we see her, Katie has undergone significant life changes. She has become devoutly religious, taking the name Maud as a fresh start with a new life, a new soul, and a shiny evangelical zeal. She's left behind a mysterious and checkered past, and now works in a seaside town as a private hospice nurse. Her patient is Amanda, a former professional dancer who's dying of cancer. Amanda is bitter about her fate, and, as an atheist, she's feeling the emotional gravity of no longer existing. Maud admits to Amanda that she sometimes feels God's presence and asks if they can share a moment of prayer. In this emotionally vulnerable moment, Amanda agrees, and Maud leads them into prayer, which leaves both of them in tears. Maud believes Amanda has experienced spiritual ecstasy, and she dedicates herself to saving Amanda's soul from that moment on. And this is where things get sticky, because Maud begins insinuating her religious beliefs into Amanda's physical and medical care. Things intensify when Amanda hears from Carol, her sex partner, that Maud has asked her to leave because she was endangering Amanda's soul. This moral judgment angers Amanda, so she publicly mocks Maud in front of party guests over her unwelcomed piety. Having her belief mocked infuriates Maud, and she strikes the dying woman, and, of course, is immediately fired because of it. And suddenly, Maud senses that God has stopped talking to her. This failure and this rejection start an emotional downward spiral that triggers self-hatred and a spiritual psychosis that manifests itself in self-mutilation. And one day, God finally speaks to Maud again, loud and clear. Maud's mission hasn't changed. She needs to save Amanda's soul no matter what the cost. And in this case, the cost is going to be too much. Now, Saint Maud is an unsettling meditation on how loneliness and too much isolation can twist reality until delusion is perceived as truth. That theme hit hard during the quarantine lockdown. We saw how different groups embraced different versions of facts as we struggled to understand what the fuck had happened and what the fuck was coming. But what felt prescient to me in this film was that in the character of Maud, we have a microcosm of a dangerous split inside of our culture. Maud is both a devout Christian and a medical professional, but she cannot separate the two, even when it affects the patient's needs. Now, hospice care, which is what she's in, is unique in that caregivers allow patients to incorporate faith into the end of their life as much or as little as the patient wants. The patient. Maud asking to pray with Amanda isn't a problem because it's a request, and Amanda still has all the control. She has control to accept or deny that prayer. But Maud's belief that she is now Amanda's spiritual guide and can then influence the woman's life on moral grounds is a problem. As a medical professional, Maud is in a power position over a weak and vulnerable patient who is dependent completely on her aid. And now Maud's beliefs supersede the wishes of the patient. And yet, in Maud's eyes, she's the victim, and she is the persecuted one, and she's the only one who knows the truth, and she is the female Catholic Travis Bickle, God's lonely woman. Maud is the personification of the ongoing battle between medical science and religious freedom. The anti-science sentiment during the pandemic was palpable. In the midst of this, there was this rise of healthcare workers refusing to perform medical treatments that they have religious objections to. Now, it's a divisive topic when religious morality insinuates itself into medicine and healthcare. But the idea that a healthcare worker can deny someone medical procedures based solely on their religious beliefs, well, I have to admit, it bothers me. Not only is it a broad and vague directive what someone's belief is, but it also insinuates that certain philosophies hold sway and that sin somehow plays a part in rights to medicine and medical attention. The feelings of the medical help giver are a bigger factor on whether the help is given than the needs of the receiver in this situation. But you know what? I digress. Saint Maud wasn't the only healthcare horror film that derived its anxiety from the clash of faith-based belief in medicine. Chad Crawford Kinkle's Dementer from 2019 follows Katie, an escapee from a backwoods religious cult, as she tries to turn her life around. She keeps a low profile because she believes the cult is still looking for her, so she lives out of her car, and she takes odd jobs, and she just keeps moving. We meet Katie as she pulls into another small rural Midwest town and applies for a job at a home for special needs adults. Katie is introduced to the occupants, and she shows a natural affinity with them, and so she gets the job. She arrives at the facility early every day, before everyone is up, and she washes herself in the bathroom sink. And we see that Katie has a huge branding scar of a strange symbol permanently on her back. It becomes obvious to us that even though Katie may be out of the cult, she's still mentally scarred as well, and she's not yet totally deprogrammed. She has unsettling flashbacks to rituals and initiation rites that are triggered by the isolated and structural world of the home. Katie imagines blood that covers the floor, only to remember that it was the floor of her old cult's headquarters, not this place. When her co-workers see her discomfort, they ask her if she's okay, and she passes it off as mere headaches. Katie bonds with Stephanie, one of the residents with Down syndrome. As the two build trust in each other, she finally feels like she's doing something good with her life. Things start getting a little strange when Katie thinks she hears voices, and she sees Stephanie talking to someone who isn't there. Katie starts hearing the voice of her former cult leader in her dreams. He repeats one of the lines from his favorite sermon, The devil listens to the sounds of the innocent. And then Stephanie gets sick, really sick. The diagnosis is some kind of respiratory illness, but Katie senses disturbing personality changes in Stephanie. She also hears strange, beastly voices coming from the Fisher-Price radio that Stephanie carries around with her. These voices, she's heard them before. She heard these voices on recordings she was forced to listen to when she was in the cult. And without a moment's doubt, Katie's programming kicks in, and she is convinced that the devils are coming for Stephanie. There is demonic possession at play. And now that Katie realizes that there are dark forces after Stephanie, she begins a series of increasingly bizarre rituals to save the woman. But as Stephanie gets sicker, and Katie's behavior gets more erratic, we can't help but wonder who the demons are actually coming for. Or perhaps, who the demons really are. If you're hearing that an escapee from a backwoods cult with a ritual scar on her back got a job at a home for special needs adults already has you nervous about this movie, well, get ready. Because the film imitates a cinema verite documentary style and uses mostly non-actors at an actual home for special needs adults. And most of the actors in the film are residents with Down syndrome. Now, this information will either be unsettling or fascinating to you, or both. And director Chad Crawford Kinkle is aware of that. He wrote the character of Stephanie for his sister Stephanie, who has Down syndrome, and set the film inside her facility with her friends. The press release said this: Kinkle has gone to great lengths to create a bold genre film that embraces and properly represents the developmentally disabled, while still being both thrilling and disturbing. The result is a singular, deeply personal, independent feature unlike any before it. Now, with that said, it's the queasiness factor that some will feel watching Dementer that gives it its timely power. There's anxiety when we see how isolated these special needs folks are from society and how vulnerable they are to their caretakers. The daily routine and conversations we hear from Katie's coworkers tell us how much turnaround and need there is in this area of healthcare. There's also the edge of knife life that Katie has. How so many people out there are now living out of their cars. They are living at this nomadic life as the working poor. And the surrounding town is barely functioning, where everything has a rusted agricultural and industrial look. We see the inside of slaughterhouses and gas station convenience stores. All of this makes the presence of a cult even more disturbing. We see no cohesion in the community. There's no growing economy or industry. There's just a lot of empty space and empty time. And this is fertile ground for cultish religions and theories to entrench themselves. We have Katie, who physically left the cult, but she's still there mentally. In fact, she still believes a lot of what she was taught and doesn't even seem to recognize that she's crossed into ritualistic behavior. The idea that people could be entrenched in a cult and not even know it hit home in the last few years, especially when that ideology preyed upon the disenfranchised and the powerless. One of the biggest trends I noticed over the last 10 years has been a focus on cults as the movie monsters of choice. It has only accelerated over the last 3 years, and we will talk more about that later in part 2. But for now, let's look at another theme that accentuated some of the changes we went through during this season in the abyss. One of the more harrowing and tragic developments of a rapidly spreading and highly contagious virus was the lonely death. Early in the pandemic, there were reports of hospitals at capacity, and then there were reports of morgues that were overflowing. Bodies were stacked on top of each other and kept in refrigerated storage trailers until space opened at funeral homes. We couldn't look away from death as easily as we could before, and we couldn't occupy ourselves with a busy life to lessen that dread. Because of the rapid transmission, hospitals had to change the visitation policies to try to reduce the threats of a contagion. Early on, COVID-19 was dangerous to anyone of any age, but it was particularly deadly to the elderly and the very young. The disease spread through families like wildfire, and this made hospitals dangerous places for healthy people. The horror of this was that for many of the elderly who went into the hospital with COVID, they never left. The families had to say goodbye through video monitors or with a pane of glass between them, or they weren't even there at all. Now, death is a common theme in horror films, but it's usually about our fear of dying, our own mortality. But recently, some horror movies have started to focus more on the horror of surviving the death of others than our own deaths. These movies added the themes of grief, guilt, and even shame and paranoia to the horror, just like the pandemic did. The movie The Vigil from 2021 takes place in the Hasidic community of Borough Park in Brooklyn. Yaakov Ronen is a former Hasidic Jew who's trying to acclimate to a non-Orthodox life after a life-altering event made him leave his faith. Now, this is a major life change, as a devoutly conservative religion is insular and cut off from most secular life. So we meet Yaakov at a support group for people who have left the community, and we hear how disconnected they are from everything. When he leaves, Yaakov is confronted outside by Reb Shulam, a member of his former Orthodox community, and Reb has a proposition for him. Shulam wants to pay Yaakov to hold vigil as a shomer for a Holocaust survivor who recently died. He would need to sit in the dead man's home as a guardian for 5 hours until the morticians came to take the corpse away. We find out that the original shomer left because he was afraid. So Shulam is willing to pay Yaakov a larger amount to cover him. Although he's suspicious of an ulterior motive for why he's the one who's picked to do this, Yaakov needs the money, and so he agrees. Now, when Yaakov gets to the house, he finds the body under a sheet in the living room, and the widow is upstairs in her bedroom. We find out that the wife suffers from Alzheimer's, which is a concern, but there's also another complication that doesn't show itself immediately, and this complication comes from Yaakov himself. See, he hasn't let anyone know that he is under psychiatric care for PTSD. Yaakov is plagued by some traumatic incident that we get to see pieces of as his sitting with the dead awakens these harsh memories. And as the night rolls on, something else seems to awaken in the house too. Something that won't let go of the dead or let the living leave the house. The Vigil gets a lot of power from the simple premise of someone sitting alone in a quiet house with a dead body under a sheet. I mean, perfect for a horror film. Even when the body isn't in frame, you are aware of it. And the movie plays off the amplification of every sound and the sight of every shadow. Everything seems to be moving. Watching Yaakov slowly freak out as he sits isolated in this silence, unable to go outside, aware of the dead around him, really felt topical. But the reason The Vigil gets under your skin is because of how it explores the overpowering destructiveness of grief. There are several ghosts and demons at play here, such as the bottomlessness of grief from losing a loved one. And another is the demon of survivor's guilt, a monster that eats you from the inside. Dealing with the dead is one thing, but dealing with a loved one while they are dying is another. In the 2020 film RELIC, 3 generations of women come to terms with the slow dread of dying. Edna is an elderly widow who lives alone in a remote family home in the woods, and she is also the mother to Kay and grandmother to Sam. first thing we see in the film are indoor Christmas lights and a Christmas tree pulsing on and off in a dark room. There is a sound to this throb. The next thing we see is an overflowing bathtub. And the water has been running for so long that the staircase is becoming a waterfall. At the bottom of the staircase is Edna, naked, staring into the room, throbbing with Christmas lights, as if she is watching for something. For a long while, she stares into the darkness, waiting, looking. And then she slowly turns away. And that's when we see a dark shadow rise from behind the tree. Days later, Kay gets a phone call from a neighbor that Edna hasn't been seen for a while. So Kay and Sam drive out to the remote house. They find the house locked and bolted from the inside, and Sam climbs through a dog door to enter. Edna is not to be found inside the house, but the home is full of signs that Edna has been slipping into dementia. The house is filthy, and there are piles of junk and piles of clothing, and it's everywhere. And the walls are stained, but they're stained with a strange black mold. Kay reports her mother missing to the police, who search in vain for the woman. As Sam and Kay clean the house and they search through it, they find post-it notes that Edna left for herself. One in particular bothers them. It says, "Don't follow it." As they keep searching the house, they hear something scraping and thudding behind the walls. And they start to notice the black mold is growing everywhere. And then one morning, Kay is awakened by a whistling tea kettle. Edna's in the kitchen, acting as if she was never gone, except her bare feet are caked with mud. The doctor checks Edna out, and her memory seems strong, and she seems physically healthy, except for a dark black bruise on her chest. It's a bruise that is the color and pattern of the mold on the walls. Kay and Sam stay on to watch over the elderly woman, and what starts as old arguments bubbling to the surface start to become something else. They become changes in personality. Something is happening to Edna, but it's not just happening to her. Kay is haunted by something from the past, something terrible that suddenly enters her mind and cannot leave. And as the scratching and banging in the walls continue, the women begin to believe that there is another force in the house with them. But that's not all they have to fear, because something is also happening to the house itself. And there is something under the bed. Relic starts with a creepy mystery and then slowly cranks up the dread before going in a completely unexpected and surreal direction. There is plenty of disturbing imagery to go around, especially a flashback to what may be a memory or maybe a recurring nightmare. But what is truly harrowing is how the movie dives into the mixture of grief, terror, and sorrow that accompanies long-term illness. Even though the movie uses monster metaphors, there is an authenticity to the emotional anxiety of inevitable death that you just don't normally see. It feels like a maturity we learned from sitting with death long enough that all the hyperbole and all the romanticism has drained away. And what the movie leaves us with is a horror film full of mourning and, as crazy as it sounds, compassion. Another film I wanted to bring up is Remy Weeks' His House from 2020. Nothing about this film's plot has anything to do with the pandemic, but I think emotionally and thematically, it relates to the season in the abyss. The story is about a married couple who escaped the war-torn Sudan as refugees, and they seek asylum in London. They trade one abyss for another. They are granted probational asylum, and they are given a dilapidated home in government housing on the outskirts of London. Even though there's trash piled in front of the house and the front door is broken, their probation officer gripes that it's bigger than his place. They're allowed to be there and in line for asylum as long as they adhere to a bunch of strict and demeaning rules. The big rules are that they cannot get jobs or subsidize their meager government stipend, and they have to stay in this house until they are granted full asylum. They can leave the house, but when they do, the tenement area is a concrete maze, and the neighborhood is threatening. Essentially, they are kept on a life support system, unable to improve their situation, stuck in limbo. And of course, the house they get has an evil spirit in it, an apeth known as a night witch. Except, the night witch may not have come with the house. It may have come with them. The couple live with the guilt and grief of losing their daughter out at sea when they cross the Mediterranean in an overpacked refugee boat. And now, inside of this house, they are being haunted and attacked by all the people who died in their village and refugees who died in their dangerous journey. They are even attacked by the girl they lost out at sea. Now, his house has a strong message about the plight of refugees, the difficulty of assimilation, grief, and the guilt that comes with surviving. The movie was universally praised, and I think that part of that is because the film helps elicit empathy for refugees. I think that the sense of limbo resonated, the idea that we are prisoners in our houses for months on end. But I think the resonance was something more visceral and darker about our society during this pandemic. Several times in his house, government agents working on the couple's asylum case voice their contempt and resentment about the two. More than once we hear agents saying that the house the couple has is bigger than theirs, and they dismiss any complaints that these people have as them being ungrateful. The couple are treated with either hostility or indifference from their neighbors who live in the same squalor. It's not that people couldn't empathize or sympathize with refugees fleeing for their lives and seeking asylum, but finding out that their social situation is at par with third world refugees is too much for them to bear. It was a painful reminder of how a system that they worked to support had left them behind and how bleak their future is. Deep down, they know that the structure they've supported is falling apart and there's nothing they can do about it. Their anger and their frustration with an institution that they can feel crumbling under their feet is misdirected to something that they can hurt these refugees. And in our real world, we saw $2,000 checks politicize a disease and saw victims turn on each other. We took a global tragedy and turned it into a diabolical plot to destroy an already weakened institution and blame relief for the damage. Violence against the homeless increased during the pandemic. Asian Americans found themselves victims of violence after COVID-19 was nicknamed the Chinese virus, even if they weren't Chinese. We went out of our way to make those who needed help to survive feel guilty for surviving. Now, to close part one, I wanted to talk about a movie that I think encapsulated a lot of the madness of our seasons in the abyss. And just like our time in the abyss, the reception for the movie was deeply divided. It's the follow-up to another movie that was deeply informed by the pandemic and how it changed our lives, which was the all-Zoom film Host from 2020. Now, that movie was comprised completely of a remote Zoom meeting among friends who want to try an online seance. Oh my goodness, that is a pretty old and creaky idea. But Host added our anxiety and our boredom during quarantine to spice that story up. It used the limitations of technology and how we read visual data to create a low-budget gem with a few legitimate scares in it. As such, director Rob Savage's Host, was a cult hit and had generally positive reviews from horror fans and critics alike. Now, the same cannot be said for his follow-up, DASHCAM, from 2021. This movie has a 48% critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 35% audience rating. And those 65% of audience members that gave the movie a rotten score hate the movie. Hate it, like on a deeply personal level. Now, if you've listened to my show for a while, you might remember the show that I did that was called Death by Convenience. In that show, I looked at trends I saw in the decade from 2010 to 2020. And I said the series of films that best epitomized that decade was the Purge franchise, which got me some emails. I didn't say they were the best films, but I did say that they were a potent barometer of our culture and our anxieties. Every year that there was a film like that, the years progressed, so did the movies. As I bring up DASHCAM, I'm looking at it in the same way. I'm not saying it's the best movie of the last 3 years, or that it's one that you're even going to like. But I am saying that this movie crystallizes how it felt to live through this pandemic and beyond, and does so with no apologies. If you read either critical reviews or viewer comments, you'll hear how repellent the main character is. Even if they liked the movie, they hated the main character. This is a movie where everyone wants to see the final girl fucking die. DASHCAM takes place entirely on a streaming video on people's iPhones. We join the live feed for Band Car, hosted by Annie Hardy, where she drives around making dirty rap songs from audience suggestions. Annie Hardy is a real person, and she's part of an LA music duo known as Giant Drag, and she also has a YouTube show in real life called Band Car. Yeah, you guessed it, she drives around making dirty rap songs, and she plays an exaggerated version of herself for this movie. Now, I'm not sure how exaggerated this version is, but I can tell you the Annie in the movie is a real piece of work. She's a total MAGA head with a red cap and a t-shirt that says "No Liberals," and she is awash in Pizzagate theories. And yet, you get the sense that she's spouting this shit because it's the rebellious, shocking thing to do and say, not out of true belief. She doesn't sound like she understands politics or culture, but she does believe in being a walking chaos theory of her own. When we meet her, she is escaping the US before the lockdown happens, and she decides to head to the UK. Now, it's not that she thinks the UK is going to be a bastion of freedom. It's just that she has an ex-bandmate there. So, as is her MO, not only does she come over uninvited, but she also breaks into her friend's house unannounced. Of course, she's outraged when he and his fiancée are upset by her actions, and she mocks them for being so straight and stupid. You get the idea that Annie was punk rock as long as it meant she could take stuff without paying and have no accountability. Just when you think she can't be worse to her old friend, she steals his car and then impersonates him on his DoorDash deliveries so she can grab some free food. Of course, every stop gives Annie a chance to mock anyone who wears a mask and offend whatever minority is in her path. While she's doing this, she's broadcasting everything live to her fans. At one of these stops, she's offered money by the shop owner to chauffeur an elderly woman named Angela to her destination. Annie sees easy money to be made, and she thinks the woman's drunk and will be an easy person to fuck with. However, on the way to the destination, Annie finds out something else is wrong with Angela, and whatever it is, it's something supernatural. And there's something supernatural out there after Annie. Now, your enjoyment of DASHCAM will come down to how much you can enjoy the subversiveness of what's going on. Now, not the subversiveness of what Annie says or does, but what happens around her, what the consequences are, and who suffers them for her. That's the subversive part of this film. This is a movie where you may find yourself rooting for something to finally kill Annie, but you just know it's not going to happen. That would be too easy. We see her in serious harm's way. We see her in total terror, and she's sure she's going to die at certain points. And yet, through all of this, she learns nothing. She doesn't even show remorse. But the truly subversive masterstroke of DASHCAM is to have the entire ordeal live streamed to a gaggle of fans who comment constantly. We are in the live feed, remember, so we get to see all of the messages, and through the entire movie, on the side, you get to see the comments. And we get to see how some people feign concern for her well-being, and others tip her for entertainment. It's just another show. Even better are her more like-minded fans who tell her to show her tits while she's whimpering, hiding in the dark. These bros laugh at her terror, and they make racist jokes, and they declare how fake the deaths look, and how it all feels like fake news. DASHCAM kicks us in the nuts by letting us see a society that watched the coming plague and Armageddon from our beds and from our coffee tables. We all watched the real world implode from a safe, isolated distance, keeping the danger at arm's length through a webcam and through our software. The apocalypse had a running audio commentary like MSTK 3000, allowing a huge gap between those who were dying and those who watched from the bleachers. And the scary thing is, no matter what our point of view or our moral stance was, we were all commenting from those bleachers. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this essay, Seasons in the Abyss. I wanted to thank everyone for listening to Hellbent for Horror. We are 100% listener funded, and if you'd like to support the show in that fashion, there are several different ways you can do it. If you want to use a debit card or a credit card, you can contribute an amount per episode on Patreon, and you can also use PayPal. I know that not everyone wishes to use Patreon or PayPal. You can also donate through Squarespace on the Hellbent for Horror website. H4H is also listed on Zelle, a digital transfer service that works with most U.S. banks. You can find me on Zelle through my email address, scott@hellbentforhorror.com. I'm also painfully aware that there aren't any excellent and straightforward options for my fans overseas, so we do have a P.O. box. If you're inclined to do so, you can send checks and money orders and even voodoo dolls to my P.O. box. You can find the address and other options available to my listeners at hellbentforhorror.com. And to my international friends, especially in Europe, if there is a friendly payment option for you to use, let me know. I thank all of you for listening, and I thank all of you who continue to help us through your kind support. My primary purpose for creating Hellbent for Horror was to start a conversation, and I thank all of you for promoting my bad behavior. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.